Hey guys, I'm starting work on rebuilding the block capacitors. I went online and did a little research. I googled Philco bakelite block capacitor and I got a hit at philcoradio.com where they had this fantastic two-page service bulletin that lists all the part numbers that Philco made and shows how they were internally wired and shows you the capacitance values. So I don't have to hunt around on the schematic and try to read this blurry text down here and kind of figure out what caps go in what blocks. I can now work off of this. However, when I read the part numbers off of these, like this is 3615AJ, I didn't find it listed here. And then I looked on the second page and they list discontinued with the replacement value, and that's where I found them. So for example, here was 3615AJ, and the replacement is 3615 ODG, which just so happens is the very first one listed here. So it's two sections, both 0.05, and the working voltage is 400 volts. And this is how they wire up. So inside of this block, I need to put these two guys. These are 0.047 rated at 630 volts, which is perfect for replacement. The capacitance is very, very close, and the voltage rating is even higher than the original, so got plenty of overhead for that. I was asked online if I was going to restuff these. I could. I've done it on these paper caps now and then. And I have picked up some glue sticks that are colored, so I could put the caps in there and melt this black hot glue into there, but there's really no point because they mount like this and nobody's ever going to see it. The only reason I could think what you might want to is if there's some vibration from the speakers and these might be wobbling around a little bit loose, but really I don't see that being a problem because the way you mount these is you run the leads through, wrap it around the terminal and solder it on, so it's a very secure attachment. I went through the other four and I found three of them, but there was one I couldn't find. So that one I'm going to have to do a little reverse engineering based on the schematic. Was this guy, 8035D. I found the 8035B, and then there's a C and an E, but there's no 8035D. So on that, I will have to go through this. If you look carefully, it'll say, for instance, on this condenser double 0.05-0.05, 3615AJ. That was that first one I was just showing. So it is possible, even without this document, to figure it out, but I thought this was really cool and very handy to find. I finished rebuilding all the capacitors. It's actually pretty easy once you clean these out. I used some Q-tips and lacquer thinner. Then following these diagrams, I fed the new capacitors through, wrapped the leads around the studs on the other side, and soldered them in place. I found that capacitors like this, radial capacitors, are easier to use in the axials, which you would have to bend over and then kind of squeeze in there. Some of them are mica caps, like these guys, and here's that one safety cap. I still have to do the tone control and this box. For the box, I'm going to use these 4 capacitors. I'll solder all the common leads together and then attach it to the can just like the original. There's still the fragment of a wire left. And then I'll attach wires to them to replicate this look. I've got some cloth covered wire I'll use. One thing I don't like about this stuff is that it's a lot larger. So here's the original wire, and this stuff is about twice as thick. I guess that's because it's actually plastic insulation inside and it's wrapped in cloth. So it's a lot thicker in the end, but it'll work out fine. I also removed the power transformer. It may seem kind of crazy, but I want to paint this Well, first I want to get the rust off, prime it, and then repaint it so it'll look nicer. It was actually pretty easy to do. Just had to unsolder a few leads and came right out. It also lets me clean up the chassis better, get rid of the rest of this corrosion, and then prepare it for painting. So there's not much left on the chassis now. A lot easier to work with. These pop right out. So when it comes to painting this, I will just have to mask off 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tube sockets, and I'll mask over these transformer cans, and I'll remove these controls and just stick them inside and plug up the holes. And likewise on the back side here. Really all I want to paint is just the outside cover to the transformer, so I undid the bolts that hold it on and pried up the tabs a little bit and popped these sides off, so now I can paint these while I put this aside for safekeeping. In case any of you are curious, this is what a transformer looks like inside. It's a bunch of laminated steel plates that are E-shaped, and they feed in from either side into the core here, and then there's a bunch of coils of wire around it. And they all feed out the ends and go to the radio. I removed all the rust from the 2 clamshells, then roughed up the old paint with some 220 grit sandpaper. Now it's ready for some primer. I'm going to use this Rust-Oleum filler primer, which is great for filling in imperfections and rust pits. Now, technically, it's way too cold to be spraying out of my back porch. It's probably about 30 degrees out there. But I've kept these metal parts inside so they're nice and warm, as well as the paint. So I'm going to go out there, spray it, wait a couple minutes, then bring it inside, let it set up for a while, give it a second coat, bring it back inside, let that set up, give it a light sanding, see how it looks, see if the imperfections are filled in, and give it as many coats as I need to fill them in. Shouldn't take too many, I think, though. I've used this before and it works quite well. It also binds really well to old paint and bare metal. Once that's done, I can move on to the black enamel paint. While I have the transformer out, I've been cleaning up that area of the chassis. And I came across this guy, and I couldn't figure out what the heck it was, because it's nowhere on the schematic. It connects right to the antenna input, which is this connector here. There's 2 on the back. There's 1 up here for ground, and 1 down there for the antenna. And that comes right off of this lug here, and goes straight over to this gizmo. Well, when I removed it, I found that it consists of this gooey looking thing. It actually looked a lot worse before, but I cleaned it up with a bit of alcohol. And it appears to be a capacitor. There's a couple of metal plates here with, I think, some mica in between. Well, I went back online and did some research and found out that there have been many revisions of the Philco 60, and apparently I have one of the last, which added this circuit they show here in red, which is what's called a wave trap. So right from the antenna to this coil and condenser, and I believe that was used to kind of tune the antenna for the AM band and shortwave band, and then it fed into the circuitry just as it did before here. And there's also a few other changes throughout. They're all highlighted in red here, so I'm glad I've got the proper schematic now. It should save me some head scratching in the future. Here's my assembly of capacitors to go into the filter condenser bank. I was careful to use different colored wires so I could tell what was what. For example, 2 of them are identical, both 0.09, although I used 0.1, and I had those both red. They all connect to ground, so they're interchangeable, but I need to know which one are the 0.09s, and the 0.05 is the yellow, and the 0.5 is the orange. I was also careful to pay attention to where the wires go to. That's what these sticky tags are in here. So the longest one is the one that has to go all the way down here, and that's the long orange wire. The two in here are actually close by, and those are the two shortest red. And the fourth one goes over here, and that's the yellow. So as these are mounted, they go, oh, right about there. So I've got plenty of extra wire length. Now this is kind of flopping around and it's not very secure, so a couple things left I want to do. One, I'm going to slide some heat shrink tubing over these wires to better insulate the joints between the capacitor lead and the wire. And then I'm going to encase the whole thing in something. I haven't quite decided yet. But eventually it's going to go inside this box. And this black lead I've stripped here will get soldered on right here. That's where the old capacitor was soldered onto. And then finally I have to thread these wires through this hole. And because this wire is thicker than the original, as I mentioned before, I'm going to have to enlarge that hole a bit to fit these 4 wires through it. I ended up using some hot glue to hold everything together. Now I can slide it inside here. Bend those tabs back over and solder the ground lead on, and I should be good to go. Here's the transformer covers after a couple rounds of primer and sanding. I think one more coat of primer and sanding, and then I can move on to the black enamel. Here's something else I have to deal with that's kind of tricky. The grid cap leads are very brittle. This one, the clip broke off entirely and this wire is very fragile. This one's about ready to go, and this one's not so hot either. Now this one's easy enough to replace. The wire's just coming straight through. This, not so much because it's inside this can, but at least this can I can unscrew from below. See the end of the threaded screw coming up here. But these shields are pop riveted on, one over here and one over here, and the cans are joined together. They seem very solid. So either I have to remove these pop rivets, or I could remove the coils from below. There's just one hex screw holding them in, but there's all those wires. And there's also the chance I could damage those coils, so I think the easiest thing to do is to drill out those 2 pop rivets. This one's easy to get at, it's just right there. That one's kind of in between these cans. I'll have to see how long my drill bit is to see if I can get in there without scraping up against these 2. My hope though is if I take those 2 out, this whole assembly will pull right out. One down, one to go. It actually wasn't so bad. Just drilled it out a little bit and tapped it through. And these cans definitely are fused together, which seems odd. I've never seen this. There's just so much gunk between these, but yeah, they seem pretty well solidly attached together. Yeah, I just have to get that one out. I got the second rivet out and the cover came right off. So now it'll be much easier to replace this wire. While I've got the tube shields off and all the capacitors unmounted, I'm going to go ahead and finish dealing with this chassis. It was quite rusty when I got it. You can see the areas where the cadmium plating had failed and rusted out quite badly all around in here, and really bad up in this corner and through here. I've removed all the rust as best I can, but it's left this deeply pitted steel. I then roughed it up with some 220 grit sandpaper, and now I want to get some primer on it, because if I don't, it's just going to start rusting quite quickly. So I'm just going to use a brush to put it on here rather than masking all this off and spraying it, because I really want to get that on, because in the past I've removed the rust, let it sit for a few weeks, and it just got all orange again with the rust. So I want to hit it up with primer all throughout here, and then probably sand that, put a few more coats on to try to fill in some of these deeper voids here. And once I got all that pretty good, I think I will attempt to mask off the coils and the sockets and spray the whole thing with some chrome silver type enamel paint. Well, it may not look pretty, but this rusty metal primer is good stuff, and it shouldn't be rusting again anytime soon. I'll have to let that sit about 24 hours before I can work on this again. In the meantime, I will tackle these guys. I'll need to cut these open and put a new electrolytic capacitor inside of each one. Oh, and here's the transformer covers. After the primer, put on a few coats of black and then clear coat, and it's all dried now. I think they came out pretty nice.